So we can do this a number of ways. I had a little presentation that we can, if we needed to um, essentially sort of organize our discussion of voting.
Sure.
Um, but I did want to maybe sort of talk a little bit about sort of the context of why, we find ourselves in sort of this situation, right? That the absentee ballot is being so heavily emphasized,
Right.
and kind of what's happening with that.
Right. Well, sure. Yeah, I'll kick it off. And by the way, hi, Catherine, and everybody watching. It's nice to be with you all here tonight. Another Facebook Live Zoom meeting for those of you who've been doing a lot of these lately, like me. Um, so, Kat, as you know, I and a vast majority of the county clerks across the state had petitioned the Supreme Court to allow us to conduct this primary election all by mail in order to just vastly reduce the number of individuals who had to physically come to a polling location in order to vote. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court, as you know, decided that they did not have the authority to give us permission to do that. So we are moving forward, conducting an election under what we term the status quo. In other words, opening up polling locations. The county clerk's offices, of course, are open. Early voting locations will open up across the state on May 16th at satellite locations around the state, and of course, in-person voting on election day. A number of clerks, of course, like the Santa Fe County Clerk, current county clerk, Geraldine Salazar, have decided to reduce that number of locations for two reasons. First, because we are very heavily pushing absentee voting and have even mailed out an absentee ballot application to every registered Democrat, Republican, and Libertarian in the state. So that they can hopefully participate by absentee voting rather than coming in person to a polling place and potentially exposing themselves or others to COVID-19, but also to protect the poll workers. There are a number of, hundreds literally across the state of volunteers who will be helping run our elections in polling places, and we need to try to keep them safe as well. And it's quite frankly, it's really hard right now for our county clerks to recruit enough folks to come and work these long 12-hour days on 14-hour really days on election day and at early voting. So that's kind of where we are right now. And our county clerks, of course, started that in-person voting at their clerk's offices yesterday, May 5th. So the election is happening. As
So I did want to ask a few things about that. So, in terms of sort of poll workers, I mean, how few or sort of what percentage and response rate? I mean, I guess I'm sort of interested in people who are poll workers. I've always found to be very duty bound. They really have this belief that everybody has the right to vote. I've had very good experiences actually in Santa Fe voting, particularly. There's this story I have the first time I think. I voted in a primary here. The power was out. I mean, it was like a horror story, right? The power was out. The streets were flooded. It was a Friday. It was 4:30. I realized I couldn't be there for the next 2 days. It was like the last Friday to vote. And uh, like there was like a car crash right next to the clerk's office because the lights, of course, were out and it was flooding. And I thought there's no way they're going to be able to let me vote. But I did run in there. It had 10 minutes left to vote from close of business, and because it turned out I had to leave town, and it was dark, and they were having people vote by flashlight, and but they were highly motivated that I vote. So I've always thought poll workers are just those folks who they kind of see their job just like the or postal workers, right? That no matter what you're going to vote, and I ended up voting by flashlight. Up on the old building's top floor because there's a skylight so you could sort of see your ballot. But it was it was really dark.
wow.
I think must have been like November election, so it was dark pretty early. And I'm just wondering, it must be really hard for poll workers to have to balance that idea of safety and helping people vote. And I'm just wondering, have younger people come in? What's happening?
Well, every county clerk is doing things a little bit differently. Some of our smaller counties and clerks that have polling locations in really tiny communities, that is a bigger challenge. And funny enough, what I have found from talking with our county clerks is, a lot of those folks that come out every election, no matter what, are still planning to come out this election. The challenge with that, of course, is that, as you know, the majority of our poll officials across the state are over the age of 60. So now county clerks not only have to, ensure that these folks are trained in terms of what their duties are at the polling place, but they have to kind of take these huge precautions to protect the safety of poll workers while they're working the election. And so while in our smaller counties, we see these just really hardcore individuals, coming out kind of no matter their age. And in our bigger counties, Valencia County is a good example, Bernalillo County, it is more of a challenge. And so one of the things that we've done is, of course, emphasize recruiting younger poll workers. As you know, Kat, in New Mexico, if you're 16 years old, you can work at the polls here. So counties like Bernalillo that already have really strong what they call a student election clerk program have definitely been really trying to emphasize that for this election. But also, our office, the Secretary of State's office, formed a partnership with New Mexico Workforce Solutions. Of course, as you know, there are just so many people out of work across the state right now. And of course, there is unemployment available for these folks, but there's a lot of folks just sitting on their hands at home who would rather be out doing something and helping further our democracy, who maybe couldn't, get time off to work as a poll worker in the past, right? So we're really trying to take advantage of that, put our county clerks together with the rapid hire coordinator at Workforce Solutions to help them get that additional poll worker help as well. So it looks a little different across the state, but we're really pulling out the stops and doing everything we can to make sure that our county clerks have the support they need to run the election.
And is it too late to apply to be a poll worker for those out there, or is it, or if you're unemployed, for instance, can you still apply to that program with Workforce Solutions?
Sure. And I would just say anybody who wants to work as a poll official, just call your county clerk's office and get on the list. I know from my personal experience as a county clerk that we are always continuing to hire folks even up to the last minute. I think the challenge with this election in particular is that as we get closer to election day, and depending on how things may change, people may end up going back to work. People may end up becoming more concerned about their personal safety and like everything in between, that clerks are going to be continuing to hire and train folks, all the way up until June 2nd. And I think on June 2nd, our clerks are really going to need actually a good cadre of backup folks, right? Just in case, who knows what might happen. So people should just call their clerk's office, get on the list, and be ready to answer the call, right?
Yes, I mean, so campaign and campaign staff can't join. So, the
Right.
very people who are really interested maybe in furthering democracy also need to make sure that they're keeping their distance. So
Exactly.
it's frustrating, right? Because you want to get in there and help, but as a candidate, they're like, nope, you have to stay away.
Exactly
It's
right.
good, which is the right thing, but
It's the right thing.
it's if you're used to sort of rolling up your sleeves, it can be frustrating. So I did want to maybe I made a little presentation, a super dorky presentation. But I thought we could sort of review because these are some of the questions that have actually been texted today. It's kind of funny.
Great.
Because I posted online, May 5th. This is the last day to do certain things. And actually, I noticed that because the rules have been changing in the last few years, some of the campaign information that's being put out by other candidates, not that they meant to misinform, was not quite right. And I think there's a lot of confusion about the overlapping definitions of things. So I
Sure.
thought we could sort of go through what the timeline looks like, especially important dates, and
Yeah.
that sort of like, is registration happening and when can you do that? And because those things have changed in the last few years. And a few people were surprised to learn they could still register if they, depending on their circumstance. So,
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk through it.
okay.
Absolutely.
So, super nerdy presentation coming up. Hold on, let me share my screen.
Great. All county clerks have to be super nerdy at some level. That's the name of the game.
Okay. And I can't tell.
I'm seeing the,
Are you seeing the live feed? Or are you seeing my presentation, my Prezi?
oh, I can see your Prezi. It just needs to go into slides.
Okay.
There you go.
Sweet. We're cash here.
Nicely done.
Okay, so I thought we could talk, and I'm gonna move my our little folks over here. Let's see. Sorry, we're just our big heads are
In the way.
in the way. But I wanted to talk a little bit about dates because I got a lot of texts actually. It's kind of funny when people know you're running for clerk. It's kind of like you're immediately on call for texts about, well, wait a minute, I thought that registration closed, or I thought that you couldn't register, or, and I had a lot of questions about this. And so I did want to talk about online versus not, registration versus not, and those dates, because I think
Do it.
some people said, "Oh, it's too late to apply for an absentee ballot yesterday," and I said, "Oh, no, 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 no,
Yep.
please keep applying."
No, absolutely. You're right. And I'm not surprised you're getting a lot of questions like that because, of course, I am too. And again, that's the name of the game. So you're getting a nice little intro into it before the fact.
So let's talk about, so May 5th was yesterday, and that was the first day of early voting. And I think there was a lot of confusion because I said, ballots are being mailed. And it was sort of like, I think the first step that people last week were confused about was this idea that when you apply for an absentee ballot, it's a two-step process. The Supreme Court said, they could not get around this request idea. They just got stuck on that. And so we have to request that ballot, and then the ballots are mailed. But by statute, the ballots can't be mailed until May 5th if you're in the United States.
That's
Yeah. So I thought we could talk a little bit about what that means for absentee balloting. You can still do it, and also this idea that party affiliation closed and when those dates for regular registration, why they've moved.
Sure. Well, let's talk about things kind of in little different chunks. Let's start. So May, as you mentioned, May 5th is, I always call it the magic day. And I call it the magic day before every election, 28 days before an election in New Mexico, because there's so many different things that happen that day. And it's really the first day that the election, really officially starts underway. So as you mentioned, so May 5th or 28 days before the primary, that's our voter registration deadline in New Mexico. But now that we have same day registration, what does that actually mean? So because we have, let's just talk about this in terms of the primary, just to try to keep it narrow. For the June 2nd primary, as you know, Kat, we have a closed primary system in New Mexico, which means only the registered members of the three major parties, Republican, Democratic, and Libertarian, are able to participate. And so that is the deadline by which anybody who is already a registered voter in New Mexico must have picked a party. And unfortunately, now that we're within that 28-day window, if you've already been registered to vote in New Mexico and you are a declined to state or an independent, or maybe you're a minor party member like the Green Party or the Constitution Party, unfortunately, you cannot switch parties now. So think of it as we are now in a window where party switching cannot happen. So folks can still update a voter registration during same day registration. You can, if you've moved, if your name has changed, but you can't switch parties. Same day registration is available at every county clerk's office around the state and some early voting locations, depending on the county. You'll have to check with the county clerk's office to see where. And what that is for folks, again, who maybe have moved and they need to update their voter registration so they can get the right ballot, right? They can do that at the clerk's office and get their ballot and vote at the same time. And for people who've never, ever, ever been registered before in New Mexico, they are the only ones that can register and pick a party. Because they've never been registered. So they wouldn't be party switching to register and participate in this primary election. So again, for anybody who's already been registered, yesterday was really just the deadline to change your party or to update a party affiliation. And for anybody else, you've moved, maybe you lived in Albuquerque and you've moved to Santa Fe and you forgot to make sure that you updated your address to a Santa Fe address, you still have time in this window, and this window goes all the way up to the Saturday before Election Day to update that voter registration. So that's the voter registration piece of yesterday. And, paper forms that were either in the clerk's office or postmarked by yesterday are good. Any online forms that were submitted all the way up until 11:59 p.m. yesterday were also good. And at this point forward, only folks who want to do same-day voter registration to either change where they live or to register for the first time still have that option available to them.
Right. And I did want
Yeah.
to clarify, you said that yesterday the registration portal shuts down, but that's not a reason to panic. That you can still go to your clerk's office and change your essentially update your registration if you need to.
Yeah,
Or
that's
register.
absolutely right. Just, remember you have all the way till the Saturday before Election Day. I don't want to encourage everyone to wait until that Saturday before Election Day, but you can go to your clerk's office in person, wear your mask, sanitize, observe social distancing, and you can do that update to your registration in person and then vote if that's what you need to do.
Yay. So does my nerdy timeline look right?
Yeah, it looks beautiful. So I know you wanted to talk about the absentee piece too yesterday.
Yes.
What
There's,
happened?
I have a slide for that.
Great. Yeah,
says,
good.
says the nerd on the call. Hold on. Let me see if I,
Good, good.
let me see if I can. Oh, okay. Important dates. Absentee how to. Hey. Okay.
So, okay, let's talk about absentee balloting. So, as you mentioned, yesterday was the first day that clerks were allowed to start putting ballots in the mail to folks who live in the state and who aren't overseas and military voters. We get a little bit of extra time to send those ballots out. So for pretty much everybody watching, probably, if you had gotten your application in any time since we had our statewide local election in November, it would have been just sitting there kind of ready to be picked up and processed. And county clerks began being able to actually send those ballots out in the mail yesterday. They're going to be mailed out in waves. So if you had your application in before yesterday, if your ballot didn't physically go in the mail yesterday, it probably made it in today, or it'll make it in tomorrow. It'll get to you really soon. Start checking your mailbox, start checking our nmvote.org website, as you have here on the presentation, to check the status of that ballot. It was not the deadline to apply by any stretch of the imagination. There is still plenty of time for those who want to, and we're, as you know, Kat, encouraging everybody to apply for an absentee ballot, to go onto that portal or to call your county clerk's office and ask them to mail you an application, or to just simply wait and see if yours has come in the mail. As you mentioned, we put paper applications in the mail to every registered voter who had not already applied for an absentee ballot last week. You may have waited until Monday to get your absentee application filed online. And if that's the case, you might still be getting a paper application in the mail. Just recycle that if you like, or save it for a future election. But there's still plenty of time, and we can accept them, county clerks can accept them all the way up, those applications, until May 28th. That's the Thursday before Election Day. That's the last real time that they can get a ballot to you in the mail and have reasonable confidence that that ballot will get to you. If you do wait till that late, though, you need to make sure you're planning to drop your ballot back at a polling location rather than put it back in the mail, because it probably won't make it back to the county clerk in time, or it might not. And you don't want to risk that with the Postal Service. Go ahead.
So there's been some discussion about delays in mail, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think some of it may be fake news to make people make people think that their ballot won't count,
Yeah.
and some of it might be very well justified because we are reopening. In some parts of the country, we're reopening, and we're also seeing, some plans and some moves maybe to reopen slowly here in New Mexico.
Sure. Well, this is what I have to say about the Postal Service, and county clerks and our office are very dependent upon the Postal Service to, of course, make sure that all this election mail gets out and gets returned timely. And the reality is that if you live in a place where you tend not to see issues with timeliness in terms of your mail delivery, you're probably not going to have a problem. If you live in a part of the world where sometimes it does take a long time to get things in the mail, of course, that, we have parts of the state, for example, like Doña Ana County, their mail literally physically goes out to El Paso to get processed before it comes back into the state. Or northern New Mexico, far, far northern New Mexico, sometimes the mail goes into Colorado to come back. So what we want to just advise folks is, from what we understand in talking with the Postal Service, they feel very confident in their capability of handling the volume of mail this election season. They said even if every single American voter voted by absentee ballot this November, that it still wouldn't get to the peak number of parcels and letters that they see around Christmas time. So they know that they have the capacity to handle it. What's really important for folks to know is that you don't have to be in the dark about where your ballot is or where your application is. Again, on your presentation here, nmvote.org is your voter information portal. So if you've applied for an absentee ballot, if you log into that website, and on your left-hand side, you'll see a menu of options, and one is an option to track your absentee ballot. Click on that and you will see a status box that will show you when your application was received by the clerk, when your ballot was mailed by the clerk out to you. Obviously, you'll know when you get it in the mail, and then when you return it back to the clerk, if you mail it back, it will show you that when it's been received back by the clerk's office. And we really encourage folks to use that tracker so that they don't have to be in the dark. And if there is ever a question about where their ballot is, they'll at least know, okay, it's been mailed to me, or I know I mailed it back. But if you want, we can also talk about like what happens if you never get your ballot and things like that.
Yeah. So one suggestion I had for people was that to sign up, if you really are definitely not going to go to a polling place and you're really worried about that, and there are certain populations I would say don't go, stay home.
I would say
But
everybody that doesn't have to go should stay
yes,
home.
well, yes, because our poll workers really are counting on you to make sure that those who are disabled and need maybe help, or people who
Right.
really need the help, um, want to use the polling places, and everybody should try to social distance as much as possible. I did suggest that we use USPS informed delivery. I've been using it the last couple of weeks, and I think it's really great. It takes pictures of almost all your mail, and so if you sign up for an absentee ballot and you use informed delivery, then you know when that ballot's arriving. You don't have to worry that it's somehow got lost in the mail. And then the clerks are very, very good about once your ballot has arrived, checking that in. So if you've mailed it and it's been a few days and your ballot hasn't shown up yet, I wouldn't leave it to the last minute. I would definitely, check in and see, let's say 4 or 5 days. It should definitely be back in the portal, checked in. So
That's right. So you can, for those of you who don't know, if you go to the Postal Service website, USPS.gov, and sign up for what Kat was just talking about, informed delivery, you will literally see like what's been delivered to your mailbox every day. To, if you're like me and you have a mailbox, kind of in the middle of the neighborhood, and you're like, do I need to walk all the way over to my mailbox today just to pick up that piece of junk mail? You don't have to do that, but that is very helpful. I think one thing that I want to emphasize, and again, because as you and I are talking about, it's so important for everybody who doesn't need to vote in person to vote from home. And again, as you pointed out, we do have populations. We have people who will need language translation services. We have people who have a disability who will need the assistance of a poll worker or to use our ADA compliant ballot marking device, right? There are people who will have to go to the polls. But if you do, But if you choose to vote absentee, like we're suggesting, and something does happen, and you just, you checked and you've seen that the clerk mailed your ballot, and it's been days and days, and you don't know where it is, and you're starting to freak out, the good news is you are now one of those people who has a good excuse to go to a polling location. You can go to the clerk's office, you can go to an early voting site, or to an election day polling location, and you can ask for a replacement absentee ballot. They will look you up in the system and just double check that you haven't already mailed your ballot back, and they will go ahead and issue you a replacement ballot. And so that's the good news. If you're far away and you don't have the luxury of going to an in-person polling location, you can also call the county clerk's office and ask them to mail you a replacement. So it's not like you will be completely out of luck if you're checking and it's been mailed and you don't get it in the mail. You have other options available to you as well.
Or if you mismark it, or if you spill water on it,
Right.
or all of the variety of things that happen.
Your dog eats it,
Dog
right?
ate it because like, oh, I really needed that. Thank you. Um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about your absentee. There's been some questions about what do I do to make sure that that vote is counted? What does it look like? What are the envelopes like? What do I have to do to make sure that that is considered a valid vote when you
Sure.
get that sort of package of envelopes and paper that comes in the mail?
Good question. So the first thing folks need to do is they will get a page of instructions along with, so you get an envelope in the mail. It will contain your ballot. It will contain 2 envelopes, and it will contain a page of instructions. The first thing you should do is read the instructions. And if you're like me and you get a new, a new piece of furniture to put together, you probably take it all out of the box first and look at the instructions last. Don't do that. Don't do that. Read that full page of instructions first, because it will tell you everything that you need to do step by step in order to vote your ballot. So that ballot, you'll mark it. You'll place it in an inner, what we call privacy envelope first. That inner envelope is just a plain white envelope. And we do that in order to protect the secrecy of your ballot. And I'll explain why in a minute. Then you'll put it in the outer envelope, which is the thing that is going to go back in the mail with the return postage paid. You need to fill out all the information on that outer envelope and stick it in the mail, and it will be mailed back free of charge. And when the county clerk gets it, they will separate. First, they'll double check and make sure that it came back from you and you've signed it and you've put your information on it. Then they'll separate that inner envelope from the outer envelope so that then your ballot becomes anonymous. Right? So that when they go to opening those inner envelopes, they all look the same and they won't be able to tell that it's yours. So I'm looking at the voting FAQ here. Do you have to fill out your ballot completely? No. It's every voter's choice to vote in as many races or as few races as they like. Of course, as Secretary of State, I encourage everybody, we have time, we're home, do your homework, get your sample ballot online at nmvote.org like I did yesterday. Make sure you go through all the races. If you have questions, do your Google searches and look up your candidates. Go to League of Women Voters Vote 411, which is a great new voter guide, online voter guide that they've put out to learn about the candidates and issues. But even if you just vote for one person on the ballot, that ballot will still count. We talked about candidate information. Again, I really encourage Vote 411 and the League of Women Voters, nonpartisan organization. They've been putting out voter guides on candidates around the country for decades. They know what they're doing. They do it amazingly well. It's very fair and balanced. How do you seal the envelope if you're using absentee? Well, we had questions about this, and you should be getting a peel and stick envelope. That is what we ordered from our vendor, just out of an abundance of caution. However, if a county clerk happened to mail yours out with one of the old lick and stick envelopes, it's actually perfectly safe to do that. According to the Postal Service and the CDC, you can lick an envelope as well. We talked about what happens if your ballot gets lost. Again, just call the county clerk or go to a polling location and ask for a replacement ballot. And how do I check if I'm registered with a major party to vote? Again, visit that nmvote.org website. Look yourself up in the system, and it will tell you if you're registered with a major party. And can you still register? We talked about that already, but yes, in certain cases, you can still register to vote or update a voter registration in person at your county clerk's office.
Right. So if you're not already registered with a party, you can register for the first time. And if you just want to change your address, then you can do that by going to the clerk's office and some polling places to change in order to vote in your neighborhood that you live in now. So
That's right. And I really would encourage that. I think it's really important for us all to be voting where we live. And even if that changes frequently, you can always update your voter. You can update your voter registration, every week if you want. There's no prohibition on that. So I really encourage folks being registered exactly where they're living at the moment so they can vote for the folks who will represent them.
So I did actually, someone asked me a question, texted me a question, which is, this actually did come up while I was talking to someone, the idea of the signature and signing your ballot and how often are signatures challenged realistically. There's sort of this fear around that if I send in my absentee ballot, that will give people a reason to, because we've seen in other states that people are getting their ballots rejected from signatures. Where's New Mexico on kind of that fear and maybe it's not a concern here kind of idea?
It's a good question. So to be clear, what's required in New Mexico per the statute is that you sign your ballot. There is not a mechanism for signatures to be compared. And, if you're like me, if you're like most people, our signatures evolve over time. And so I know that a concern that folks have is, well, I first registered to vote back in, 2004, and I signed my name one way then. And over the years, I've really, shortened it up or whatever. What is going to happen when the county clerks process those absentee ballots is the main thing that they're going to look for is to make sure that there is a signature. There needs to be a signature on that return ballot. That is the main thing they're going to be looking for. The next thing they're going to look for is there anything unusual in the sense that we see that this ballot is being returned by, let's say, John Smith. However, there's a signature for Margaret Smith on this ballot or for a completely different name, right? So that might be a red flag, a completely different name. Something else that might be a red flag is maybe something that's completely illegible. And, that happens. I have a 22-year-old son whose signature is literally like a little, just like almost like a little circle. And that may be a case where in every absentee precinct, there are 3 judges. At least one of those 3 judges has to be of a different political party. So it's a nonpartisan process. And so when the folks who are working on the absentee boards do see something that looks unusual, that's not just, clearly Katharine Clerk or Maggie Toulouse Oliver, they'll probably raise it up and ask for a judge to come take a look. And if there's ever a question about the validity of that signature, those 3 judges are going to confer and make a decision. Now, the good news is that it rarely happens, to your point, Katharine, that the judges will reject a ballot outright. A lot of times what we see, so the example that I gave you of, let's say, John and Margaret Smith, sometimes you have multiple voters in the same household and they'll kind of get their ballots and their envelopes mixed up. And maybe one envelope will go back in the wrong ballot and vice versa. Or we've even seen it where 2 ballots go back in the same envelope. Because these folks are thinking, oh, we'll save the county clerk money, right? Don't do that, by the way. Definitely mail it back in its own envelope. But usually when these types of things happen, it's really common, and the judges are able to figure it out. Oh, okay, we sent both Margaret and John a ballot, and we have ballots back from both Margaret and John. It's just that we have Margaret's signature on John's envelope and John's signature on Margaret's envelope, right? 9 times out of 10, they're able to really quickly figure out what happened and just put it through the normal process. A worst case scenario is that it'll be what's called adjudicated. Those 3 judges will come together and have to make a decision. In the big counties, especially, there are always observers and challengers keeping eyes on the process. So the major political parties almost always have somebody there. They're always observing. And when judges are conferring to make decisions, they're making sure that that is done properly and legally. Lastly, a voter has the chance to cure an absentee ballot that is incomplete and that doesn't have a signature or maybe has a questionable signature. And so the county clerk or a political party or an observer can reach out to that voter, let them know what's going on, and give that voter the option to come and fix it if they want to do that. So there's a lot of fail-safes built into that process.
Okay. Awesome. Sorry, I don't know that everybody's. So I just wanted to sort of go over. So this has sort of come up because the clerk's office in Santa Fe voted to sort of close polling places. That has a lot to do with the fact that we normally have a lot of polling places on tribal land, and unfortunately, because we're closing, or the tribes have decided to close because of their high risk. That means that there was a shift in where polling places would occur, and also the sort of concern of not having enough poll workers. So I don't think that any of the early voting places have closed or been closed, but I know that there were a few for the polling places on election day. And Geraldine has told me that I think one of the most useful places is that if you want to drop in a drop box because you work late, or want to social distance and drop off late at night so no one's around, you can drop at the clerk's drop box. But Geraldine has told me that she is going to try to get 2 more drop boxes for the same reason, that people can, if they're worried about the mail or they just feel more secure dropping it somewhere secure, there will be 2 more opening in the county for people to drop off their absentee ballot. And I think this information is accurate as of today.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, due to the Supreme Court decision and just, of course, everything is due to the pandemic. There's been a lot of last minute moves happening, not just in Santa Fe County, but across the state, to make sure, we have yet enough polling locations, but also to make sure that there aren't too many polling locations, especially since so many people have already opted to vote absentee. As of yesterday, we had well past 100,000 applicants for an absentee ballot, and as you know, Kat, those applications will continue to come in. So the clerks are being smart. They're not trying to get rid of too many polling locations, but they're not trying to have too many open at the same time. So definitely double checking that information is extremely important if you are a person that's going to have to go in person either to vote or to drop off your ballot.
Okay. So I think we're done with our nerdy presentation. Does anybody have any questions about voting? I see a lot of sort of comments and hearts and thumbs up, but feel free to ask any questions.
We both thank you for all that.
But I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, maybe something they've heard in terms of information they're not sure is accurate, or because part of election is also election protection, and part of election protection is trying to slap down false information, because voter confidence is one of the most important tools for getting high turnout. And so we want to make sure that if you hear a rumor, or you hear, so I hear a lot, oh, I heard that your absentee ballot doesn't count, that they don't count those. Oh yeah, because in California they have a lot of ballots they don't count for a long time, but they still count them. It takes a while, but they count them.
Yeah, that is like one of the oldest urban legends that I have been hearing since long before I was an election official. And of course, every absentee ballot counts. The urban legend used to be that they only count the absentee ballots if it's a close race. But no, every single absentee ballot does count. And I will tell you, to your point, if you're a person who waits until the last minute to get that ballot in, and you're walking in to a polling place on election day at 6:55 p.m. and you're getting it in just under the deadline, yes, that ballot is going to count, but it might get processed the day after the election or whatever. I think this is a really good place to talk about what happens after election day. For most folks, for voters, for campaigns, the champagne gets popped on election night, or folks go home crying. I've done both many times in all of my years of running and working on campaigns and running elections. But the county clerks and the Secretary of State are actually continuing to finalize election results all the way until 3 weeks after the election. County clerks have 2 weeks to canvass the election results, and that is to basically double check and make sure everything gets counted. That's when provisional ballots get qualified and counted. Any absentee ballots that weren't in the queue as of 7 p.m. on election night. And so there is a lot of work that happens on the back end. And to your point, Kat, I think a lot of people think, oh, that's shenanigans or something. No, it's the legal process. It's transparent. It's open to observers. The canvas itself, which is the final totals, gets certified by the county commissions or the state board of canvas at the state level. So there's multiple levels of transparency and assurance built into that process. But you're right, it isn't necessarily all over on election night.
Okay. And you did briefly bring up provisional ballots, and I know I personally have had a very interesting experience in the old days in California where we didn't have voting convenience centers. We had precincts, and we were assigned by precincts. And of course, when we were running a student council election, trying to get a student elected to city council, thinking, we were going to a really large school. Why couldn't we have a student on city council? All of those students that we ended up going door to door in the dorms registering ended up having to go to one polling place. And it was such a long line that they started handing out provisional ballots. And then they ran out of provisional ballots. And it was like, there were many tears, many, many, many tears that day. So I wanted to talk, I've actually have about provisional ballots, and I think other people do because of famous elections throughout the country. And I wanted to talk a little bit about under what circumstances you'd use one, because I feel like New Mexico has because we have voting convenience centers, because we have same-day voter registration up until a certain point in the election, we're really trying to get away from provisional ballots. And what circumstances would you be voting under provisional?
Well, that's exactly right. And now that we have same-day registration, for the most part, most folks should not have to vote a provisional ballot. Here's a couple of situations where somebody might have to vote a provisional ballot. The first would be if you show up to do same-day registration, if you're not already registered in your county, and you show up to do same-day registration and you're not able to have the correct ID. There is an ID, a photo ID requirement for same-day registration. Then you would vote a provisional ballot. However, if you maybe showed up a couple days later and showed that ID, it could still count. And this is true for any situation that is an ID requirement, there are very few in New Mexico. You would vote a provisional ballot in this particular election if you are not registered with a major party by May 5th. So if you are somebody, and I will tell you, this literally happens every single primary election without fail. We get a call from such and such person who says, I've been a registered Democrat my entire life. I went to vote. They said I'm not on the rolls. They called the county clerk. The county clerk said I'm a declined to state. I've never been a declined to state. Okay, this person's going to get issued a provisional ballot, and then the county clerk is going to go after the fact and double check and see what happened. It could be that there was a clerical error, or it could be that the voter, potentially went to MVD and did a new voter registration and forgot, right? But they will double check that. I think the last case is going to be, just trying to think of another example. Oh, election day. So we've been talking a lot about same-day registration. For this year, 2020, same-day registration is only available until the Saturday before election day. So if you're showing up on election day and you're not in the system anywhere, just nowhere they cannot find you, then that too will be a provisional ballot situation. So
Okay.
those are the three circumstances I think you might see provisional ballots in this election.
And when will we have true same day up until election day
Everywhere.
everywhere?
Starting in 2021. That's the way the law was written. That's the way the legislature chose to do it. The county clerks felt, and I think rightly so, that to stagger it so that they could make sure that they had all of the technical pieces in place to do it right and do it well were in place. So starting in 2021, you'll be able to same day register during any of the in-person voting period.
Okay, awesome. So I just wanted to shout out again and see if anyone has any questions. Don't be shy. We are thinking about wrapping this up, but if you have any burning questions about voting in New Mexico, we are here to answer them because I certainly have seen some misinformation going around. Not that it was intentional, but just confusion. And so we just want to make sure everybody feels comfortable asking questions because we want to make sure you can vote. So,
Kat, one of the questions I've gotten recently is, how is it going to work? What is it going to look like? If I'm somebody that has to go vote in person, or if I just really choose, like, that's how I want to do it, how's it going to be for me? So county clerks around the state, we've actually spent approximately $2 million in federal dollars that we received for this election to equip and outfit all of the county clerks, their staff, their volunteers, their poll workers around the state with PPE, making sure that they have the cleaning supplies that they need to keep the site, clean and virus-free, hand sanitizer, tape to mark the 6-foot social distancing when you wait in line, all of those things. Some clerks are installing the plexiglass barriers between the poll officials and the voters. Here's what you need to know for you yourself as a voter if you are a person that has to go vote in person. Please wear a mask, or bring a mask with you if you have one. If you do not have a mask and you have not been able to get a hold of one, there will be one provided for you at the polling location. And even though we can't mandatorily require it by law, we are asking everybody, please, if you go in person to a polling place, please wear that mask because it will hopefully prevent, especially some of our older folks that are working at the polling place from potentially being exposed to the virus. We'll ask folks to sanitize their hands when they go in, to sanitize their hands after they turn their ballot back in. And every pen that you use, everything that you touch in a polling place is going to be routinely sanitized. You'll never be touching anything that anybody else has touched without it being sanitized in between. So just know those are all of the steps that the clerks are taking to not only protect your safety as a voter, but to make sure that the folks working at the polling locations are safe as well.
okay, awesome. So I don't see any other questions, although there are some folks watching, so that's awesome.
Everybody.
But so we're gonna I think we're gonna give people a few minutes, maybe 30 seconds, I guess, more to see if they have a question. I don't know. I feel like we've been pretty thorough, and I think everybody probably wants to have dinner. So
Yeah. What are you making for dinner tonight, Kat?
probably tacos.
Yay. I'm excited. I'm going to try my hand at some chicken piccata tonight after this. So we'll see how it turns out.
Awesome. Yay. Well,
Gluten-free chicken piccata. Some of us can't tolerate the gluten anymore.
sort of the way of the dairy too, right? So anyway, I wanted to thank you so much, Maggie, for joining me and talking about voting. I realized as I was getting more and more questions about voting that there are a lot of questions and confusion about voting, and we want to make sure that people don't feel like it's hard, that it's easy if you just ask, and we're here to give you information. And if you care about voting, make sure you let people know the information you've learned. And thank you everybody for watching. And I think Adrian Carver. Hey, thank you, Adrian, for a question. He says,
Hey, Adrian.
what are y'alls? Y'all's thoughts on fusion voting. I love a good plural y'all. I love a good plural y'all. My dad lives in Texas. I love a good plural y'all.
I use the plural y'all a lot too. Kat, so I have thoughts. Kat, do you want to hit it first or do you want me to?
No, fusion voting is controversial, so I'll let you take this one.
I think so. Here's what I think. I think it's a really interesting concept, and it is something that we are in conversation about, and I think need to have more conversation about as a state. And for those out there who don't know, fusion voting, New York State is a particularly is a particular hotspot for. I shouldn't use that term these days. I got to get that out of my vocabulary. New York State is a place where they do this a lot, and what it really is it's sort of intended toward encouraging folks who maybe don't associate with a major party, but who still want to feel like they have some skin in the game when they go to vote, to really feel more included. And so what happens is when you have all these other parties, like we were talking about earlier, like the Green Party, the Constitution Party, et cetera, et cetera. What they would do is rather than nominate their own candidate, to a general election ballot, that they could pick from among the major party candidates and decide if they want to endorse that candidate as well and put a line, under, say, the Constitution Party for that candidate. So, I could be running as the Democratic Party nominee, but I could also be running as, say, the Green Party nominee. And so you might see my name more than once on a ballot. But if you're a Green Party voter and you really want to vote for the Green Party candidate instead of the Democratic candidate, you could vote that way. I think it's an interesting idea. I think we need to talk more about it. And I think that there's some major law changes that, are impediments here in New Mexico for us to get from here to there. But it is definitely something worth continuing the conversation about.
Well, I think Working Families Party really likes it because they feel like they don't necessarily want to block a Democrat from winning in the general, but they do want to have a say about what kind of Democrat gets elected. And there's another argument that fusion voting is kind of like a halfway point to parliamentary voting, where
Exactly.
you're building caucuses. So in Britain and Canada, different parties and sort of with different ideas get together and choose who's going to be prime minister, who's going to be the leader. And fusion voting is kind of a way that we can see more caucus building or more coalition building
Exactly.
around behind a candidate.
Right.
Depending on how you see it. So.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that we continue to have these conversations and these discussions about how we can improve the voting system in New Mexico and around the country. A lot of people like ranked choice voting for very similar reasons, which, as you know, we now have here in our Santa Fe municipal elections.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, if it's more inclusive and it's bringing more people to the table to have their voice in our democratic process, for me, those are important things to consider. Because anything that we can do that makes sense and that retains the integrity of our voting process, we should definitely consider.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we hear a lot about is my vote doesn't count. Look at all these presidential elections where the majority didn't win. And I think a lot of these things like ranked choice voting, fusion voting are in some ways this idea of getting around this or trying to break down this idea that there's two parties and they're stuck and that it doesn't really matter my vote because things are set in motion and I can't do anything about it. When you have different
Right.
methods of voting, ranked choice voting, at least everyone can feel like my vote counted in some way. I could have an influence on the election. So
Yeah, getting away from that whole, lesser of two evils concept that I think, we sometimes have when we go to the polls and we're choosing between, just the two major party, or in New Mexico, three, of course, but the two traditional, I should say, major parties, right?
yeah.
And you know, again, as election officials, whatever the law is, that's what we have to do, and we have to do it to the best of our ability. But it is also really important for us to be thinking about and to have these conversations and to explore these concepts and see if they can be made to work. Because again, I think we're just in a new, we're really in a new era in this country and in politics, and our democracy is not going to survive unless we can continue to generate that robust participation that we need. And it's to our benefit to have the conversation at least.
at least. And then Adrian has another question. He is asking, what happens if someone transitions and their gender expression doesn't match their identification? And I know this is a concern when you walk up to a poll worker and say your name and your address, right? Are we training our poll workers to really sort of have a non-reaction to, necessarily their perceptions and bias about what name should be?
That is definitely something that we probably need to do better, to be honest with you, Adrian, with our poll officials. What I will say generally is that poll officials are given training around sensitivity towards, all kinds of people. And, as a general rule, they are just encouraged to have the, sort of the utmost game face and have really excellent public service. But the truth of the matter is, you're right. We could have this kind of a situation moving forward. And I think that this is a great suggestion that we are going to think about how to talk with all of our clerks, because, it's our county clerks around the state that train the poll workers. They are the ones that do that difficult job. And so having the conversation with our county clerks first about how we can do a better job of making sure our poll workers are kind of ready for any kind of scenario that could come their way, I think is really important.
Well, I know there's been an interest in, so we're going to have a new VRA online portal, and I know that kind of got set aside because of COVID, which is totally understandable. But it's this idea of a very cool feature where now VRAs, which VRAs, if in case you don't know, is voter registration agent, and that's the third party person who's supposed to help you register to vote, and they're usually really enthusiastic people going to high schools and grocery stores trying to get people to register to vote, farmers markets, things like that. But we're gonna have an online feature. And what I like about that idea is that it can standardize. If you had training materials in there, it could standardize or help standardize kind of how people interact with the public, so we can make sure that people are following the rules. And I'm not saying anyone's unintentionally doing it. I just think
No, yeah.
like trainings are like telephone. One person passes on a new, and every time there's a training of a new person, the training changes a little bit. The same idea for our poll workers could apply in that we have much more standardized materials. The clerks could come together and decide what that training should look like. There could be an online portal for poll workers to take the training. And one way of getting standardization across people who are delivering materials, something I learned from being a lab manager, is that you don't want the research assistant, the person who's conducting the experiment, to be the variable. So you
Correct.
make sure it's standardized across. And one of the things we can do is sort of do, a quiz afterward and make sure that the information is being transmitted correctly. And one of the topics that we could ask about truly is about transgender and how to interact with someone that, your own bias doesn't necessarily match, and recognize what that bias is.
Right. And I think that is a great project for you, to the county clerk's office. And I just, I couldn't agree more. I think sensitivity and diversity training for, anybody interacting with the public generally is really important. And I know Adrian probably has some great suggestions about who we can bring on board. We've brought folks on board in the past to train our county clerks on, how do you interact with an individual with a disability? How do you interact with somebody who's hard of hearing or who has a visual impairment? But this diversity piece, I think, is just as critical and important. Than because, well, I don't want to get too far down that road, but I just completely agree. Completely.
Okay. Joey Dominguez has a question. Is the registration form from MVD uploaded into the voter roll so voters can see that they didn't select a party?
Great question, Joey. So the way it works is when the voter fills out a voter registration form at MVD, that data is submitted to our through their portal to our office, the Secretary of State's office. We push that data down to each county clerk, and each county clerk opens up that record and makes adds it to the voter rolls. It's not an instantaneous process, so I do want to make that clear for folks, because our county clerks still have the responsibility for double checking and making sure everything's there before they add it to the voter rolls. But it should show up as soon as the county clerk has a chance to process it. Sometimes that can take a few days, and depending on if there's a crush of voter registrations coming in, maybe even longer. But usually you should be able to see that information show up in the portal within, maybe 2 or 3 days.
Awesome. So I think we are like way, way over time, but Maggie and I
Okay, we
could probably
started
talk
late.
about voting for like ever. So I think I'm gonna cut it off before like before this goes on way too long. But I
Sure.
wanted to thank you again, Maggie, for joining me, and everybody else who watched and asked questions. That was awesome. And let's do this again sometime. So
Love to. Anytime. Love talking voting with you, Kat, and with everybody on Facebook. You all have an
okay,
awesome night.
bye. Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.